In the last lesson, we learned something about participles. We learned how to use them, and we had the present participle, that is, the present active loosing, the present passive being loosed. In this chapter, we want to get the aorist, which is going to be translated having loosed and having loosed for himself, the aorist active and the aorist middle. First, we want to start with the vocabulary on page 113. Agon, having led. Now that's the second aorist active participle of ago. Agagon. Now this participle is going to be formed on the third of the principal parts. Agagon. Egagon would be the third of the principal parts for ago. And we'll talk about no augment in a minute, but it's right out of that form. If you know that form, you know you can form the participle. Agagon, having led. Apethanon, I died. Apokrithin, I answered. That's the aorist indicative passive there. That's not a participle. Epon, having said, from lego. Elthon, having come, from erkeme. Eninkon, having borne or having brought, from pharaoh. And Edon, having seen, from orao. Now those are the forms, all the vocabulary we have, and most of them are aorist participles. Now we want to look at the forms and how they are like the ones we learned in the last chapter. Now you see the aorist active participle, and you see lisas. Now learn it across the top. This is from paragraph 242. Lisas, lisasa, lisan. See? Lisas, lisasa, lisan. And learn it that way, and then learn this way, and you'll see that you have very much the same as you had with the present, except that now you have simply the sigma alpha. Sigma alpha is characteristic of the aorist active, and you'd expect that throughout. So we have that throughout, and then you have, once you get past the nominative, you have the ontos, onti, onta, ontes, ontonus, ontas. And again here, we have the, like doxa, a, is, eon, and then aonesas. And for the neuter, ntas, onti, on, and then onta, onton, asi, onta. So these are very much like the present, except that you have the sigma alpha. Now, the other forms for the, we had the present, middle, and passive here. And the present were these, but all we have here is stick a sigma alpha in place of that omicron, in place of the variable vowel, have a sigma alpha, so it's lisamenos. But once you put the sigma alpha in there, then you have the aorist. So, lisamenos, lisameni, and lisamenon. And everything else is the same. So you've already learned this one, no problem. And that was in paragraph 246. Then in 249, you'll see another set of forms, and this is the second aorist, or the irregular forms, and that is, we're using the same one we had, the present active participle, only now all you have to do is substitute the second aorist stem, eve. This is for edon, and that e there. If you put that here, then you have the forms of the second aorist participle. Now, so these forms are just a matter of sticking one new thing in, and you have the form already learned. Now, the characteristics, we want to put those on page 25 of your workbook. Find that page, and then you ought to put these forms in. This is the present participle active, middle, or middle and passive, and then the aorist active, aorist middle, and the second aorist active. So let's go with the first one. On page 25, present active participle. The characteristics. Now the names of these: present stem, variable vowel, sign of the participle, sign of the active participle. Active participle. Sign of the active participle, and then participle endings. Participle endings right here. Okay? Then with the middle and passive, present, middle, and passive, we have present stem, variable vowel, the sign of the aorist, or sign of the middle participle, and then the participle endings. One thing you can depend on, a middle participle, middle or passive participle, will have the min. See, the min. That will be a key to you. And many of the active participles will have the neen taf, but some of them will not. But this, when you see the neen taf, then you'll know you have the active participle. The min will tell you have a middle or passive. That's the present, middle or passive participle. Now, the aorist. This is first aorist. First aorist active participle. Divided in this fashion. Present stem, the sign of the aorist active, the sign of the active participle, just as you had above, and the participle endings. For the aorist middle, and this is only middle, just as in the indicative, the aorist has separate forms for the middle and passive. So this is the aorist middle participle. And I think by now you can figure out what these are. Present stem, sign of the aorist active. We can just call it sign of the aorist, I suppose, because it's not active. Then the sign of the middle participle, and then the participle endings. This one is the second aorist active participle. Second aorist. You see the second aorist stem. Second aorist stem, variable vowel, the neen taf, which is the sign of the active participle, and then participle endings. All right, that will take care of your page 25 for a while. Now, we want to look at the usages of the participle in chapter 19. I don't think we need to say more about forms, but in this chapter and many other chapters following, you're going to see the word like, L-I-K-E. Look at paragraph 243. Like the present active participle, the aorist active participle is declined according to the third declension in the masculine neuter and according to the first declension in the feminine. Those are things we've already shown you. But he keeps using like, and when he says like, he's saying, you learned this before, now learn it here. So, or now bring it over into here. Paragraph 244 says the characteristic sigma alpha will be there because it's aorist. Paragraph 245 is very important. The augment, however, appears only in the indicative mood. Let me say that, stress that again. The augment is only in the indicative mood because the augment indicates time, and you only have time in the indicative mood. Otherwise, you don't have time differentiation between the tenses. So, no augment in the participle, no augment in the subjunctive that we got later, infinitive, in imperative, no augment. So, we won't have an augment. But we are looking for the third of the principal parts. Now, Leo is present, is Leo, and then Liso, and Elisa. That's the third of the principal parts. Elisa is the form from which we have formed our participle, but no augment. So it's not Elisas, but Lisas. That's what he's saying there in paragraph 245. The forms are given in 246, and then in 247 he says the same thing, like it was before, now it is again. And paragraph 248, the sigma occurs again. Now, in 249, we have the forms of the second aorist active participle. And then you see idon, and the epsilon has been taken off. The form for that he's coming from there is this form, idon. Idon. Well, when you make the participle, it's idon, taking off that there. And then you have to go to the participle endings, idon. But the stem is just this much. Now I'm putting that there for a purpose. We'll come right back to it in a minute and see another word like that. Don't worry about paragraph 250. That's just accenting. We're not bothering with that. Paragraph 251, augment appears only in the indicative mood. Again, he's stressing that. Then he goes on, at the top of paragraph 116, he points out that idon, you've lost the epsilon, but with epon, when you make the participle for epon, it's epon. You may have noticed that. Epon, epon. Now, the reason for that is that the epsilon here is not considered an augment. Here it is. So we don't lose it in epon, we do lose it in idon. So that's the difference between those. This will not, that's not an augment, even though it looks like it. That's what he said in that top of page 116. Other verbs like compound verbs, you have to watch because the augment in a compound verb is in the middle. And he'll take that out and put, you'll miss it there. But if you aren't careful, it won't be obvious to you. And that's in paragraph 252. So keep your eye on that one. Now the use of the participle. Remember the translation of the aorist participle for Leo is having loosed. Having loosed. Or the passive would be having been loosed. So we're going from there in the use of the participles. We said that in the present participle, the time of the participle, being relative to the time of the main verb, was going on at the same time. The present participle is going on at the same time, that action is going on at the same time as the action of the main verb. And so we used while. While he was saying these things, he saw the Lord at the same time. Now, notice paragraph 254. In accordance with the principle formulated in 233, which we just talked about, the tense of the participle is relative to the time of the leading verb. The aorist participle denotes action prior to the action denoted by the leading verb. So we're not going to be using while with the aorist, we'll be using after. He says use either when or after. Well, after is much simpler. So we'll use after. Instead of saying while he was saying these things, we'll now say, if it's an aorist participle, after he had said these things, he sees the Lord or saw the Lord. Look at the examples, top of 117. The apostle, having said these things in the temple, is seeing the Lord. And here he says, epon, the aorist participle, denotes action prior to the action denoted by vlepi. So we would have to translate that after the apostle had said, but we'll see that in just a second. Number 2, epon tafta ap eothen. Having said these things, he went away. Now the literal translation of the participle is possible. Having said these things, he went away, and that would get the idea across. However, it's better if we do it with a clause, and that's what we want to do with all of our exercises. Use a clause. When or after, forget the when. After he had said these things, he went away. So instead of while with legon, we'll say after with the epon. Now that's what he's saying there. Use after with the aorist participle, use while with the present participle. So now, we in the English, or in the present participle, translating that into English, we used saying. We said that was a translation of legon, saying. Now we're going to have with the aorist, epon, having said. Now, when I wanted to make this into a clause, all I said was while he is saying. And I kept that in its entirety. Now, when I say after he has, I can't say after he has having said. So with the aorist participle, that having is a part of the translation of the simple participle, but I have to take it out because the has or had or have whichever helping verb I use, is going to take the place of the having. And so it would be after he has said. So keep that in mind. We'll take this out. This will be our translation. We'll use this in our English diagram. We won't try to do the clause in the diagram. We'll put simply, like we did saying in the English diagram, we'll use having said in the English diagram in our translations. But when we put it into a sentence, when we make it into a clause, we'll have to drop the having. So in our sentence, writing it out, we'll say after he has said. And that's one little wrinkle that we need to square away before we go on. All right. So, number 3, page 117. Having said these things, he goes away. Now, a better translation, he says, is after he has said these things, he goes away. After he has. Now look at number 4. They came to him after he had said these things. Now you'll notice that he's alternating here between has and had as helping verb. In number 3, he said, after he has said. And you'll notice that the main verb in number 3 is present. In number 4, he said, after he had said, and the main verb in number 4 is an aorist, pros iothon, an aorist. So a past time main verb we'll use had, a present time main verb we're going to use has, and I want to show you that in the workbook. And while we're doing it, I want to give you some review. So what I'd like for us to do is to just review the way we did the participles in the last chapter. First of all, when you see a participle, here's where you begin, page 29 of your workbook. You say, what position is it? Remember that? If it's predicate position, it's not preceded by an article, then it is adverbial. It modifies the action of the verb and is. Number 1, diagrammed under the verb. Now we do this with the aorist just the way we did with the present. So we diagram it under the verb. And we translate it by the use of a temporal clause. See page 30. Now on page 30, we have some further instruction. We went through this and said, well, we use while he is. And we went down here to see why we use while, and we said we use while because the participle is present. Now, that's under A, said because the action of the present participle is seen as occurring at the same time as the action of the main verb. Then, B, this is for this chapter. Use when or after. I prefer after. Use after with the aorist participle because the time of the action of the aorist participle is prior to the time of the main verb. So I've included that in here. Then the subject will be determined the same way and the helping verb will be a little different. So if we're talking about a present participle, then with a present or future main verb we use is or are. With a past time main verb we use was or were. This is for the aorist. When you have an aorist participle and you have a present or future main verb, then you'll use has or have. Has singular, have plural. If you have a past time main verb with the aorist participle, then you use had and had. They're both the same. So we're using had if the main verb is past. We're using has if the main verb is present or future. Now, that's the way we use it. That's the way we do it with the adverbial. Same as in the previous chapter, except our helping verb and our temporal word. Now, back to here. Translated by the use of a temporal clause, but if it does have the article, if it's attributive, it's preceded by the article, then we ask the next question. What is the use of the participle? What use does it have? Is it adjective or noun? In other words, is there a noun for it to modify? If there's a noun for it to modify, then it's adjective use. Then we diagram it under that noun, and the participle is translated by the English relative clause. Same thing. And we look on page 32 for examples. The Greek construction. This is using a present participle, but the aorist participle, we said, we use who. That's the same for both participles. we use is. It says here, the helping verb of the relative clause is determined by the time of the main verb of the sentence. If it's a present or future time main verb, use is. If it's a past time main verb, use was or were. That's with the present participle. With the aorist participle, we use, if it's a present or future main verb, we use has or have. If it's a past time main verb, we use had or had. And then the translation. So again, what we're saying is that we need to just adjust our thinking using after, if it's a temporal word we're after, or using using was, were, or had, had. I'm sorry, using has, have, or had, had with the aorist participle. Back to the main chart. We've said if it's attributive, there's a noun for it to modify, then we diagram it under that noun. If it's noun use, that is, there is no noun for it to modify, then we have to determine the use of it in by looking at the case. Is it nominative, accusative, dative, genitive, etc.? Then you diagram it in the spot of its usage, and then translate it by a relative clause. We saw that in 33 to 36. And again, we have the same kind of things going on. We're using the helping verb is going to be, instead of is or are, was, and were, it's going to be has, have, had, had. And that'll be the same thing for any clause that we do. So the aorist then gives us just a different perspective on the time with respect to the time of the main verb. In paragraph 256, he says, "U is the negative of the indicative." This is page 119 of Machen. "U is the negative of the indicative, and me is the negative of other moods. Therefore, with the participle, we're going to be having me and not U as a negative." And see his illustration. The not believing one, or the man who is not believing, is not being saved. And me will be the negative. If it's the U is the negative with the sozete, because sozete is indicative. So do 10 more verses, doing from the Greek to the English, and I would say do more of those and forget the English to Greek because of some of the various things in there that would be a little hard for you to handle. After that, we'll do our final chapter on the participle, then we'll go on to other things.